Hello, thank you all for being here. Due to the technological difficulties, if there's trouble hearing me over there, I'm sorry. And thank you, again, thanks to the Humanities Festival for having us, and thank you all for coming, and William Gibson, thanks for being here. This is going to be hopefully a great conversation. I'd like to make one nuance to the, or add one nuance to the introduction, which is I would like to lead a charge to stop categorizing writers by the genres they work in. I think Bill Gibson's one of the best writers. Not that there's anything wrong with being a science fiction writer, but just to see it broadly as possible. Anyway, our ostensible topic, one of them today, is the future of science fiction, which raises some fundamental questions, I think, about genre. And that's where we'll begin our conversation, and then it will go wherever it will go. Science fiction, classically defined, would be fiction which depicts or grapples with the effects of science or technology on people, on society, with usually in some projected future, with some life-altering technology like television that can see two ways, or space travel, or computers, and so forth. But most texts, especially texts that are worth reading more than once and worth talking about and teaching and doing scholarship on, are going to occupy multiple genres. This is just the nature of narrative. There's almost never just one kind of story happening. And how do we sort these genres out? And I've been thinking about this over the years. I've taught various kinds of genre fiction. I've come up with a rule. I love rules. To try to categorize things and structure them. And I call this the rule of generic distance. When a text exhibits features of multiple genres, it will usually be classified in the genre most distant from everyday realism. So for instance, if you have a murder mystery, in the future, and one of the detectives is a robot, you have science fiction. Isaac Asimov's I, Robot. Even though it's a murder mystery. There's dead guys who done it, we're trying to figure out who done it. Can a robot overcome his programming to never do wrong to a human, and so on. But because science fiction is farther away from everyday reality, robots are farther away from everyday reality, although maybe not anymore. We put it in this other genre. And the reason this is where I want to begin today, Bill, is that your work, your novels always occupy multiple genres. The Sprawl and Bridge trilogies are set in this relatively near futures where technology that was then amazing to even imagine has sort of maybe become commonplace for us. But they're also very influenced by noir fiction, by crime fiction in general. And I just want to begin with the question of how do you understand genre as you are writing? Like how do you contemplate this sort of amorphous categorizing that writers and readers and publishers and bookstores and critics all engage in?
Well, when I was 12 or 13 years old, I know for a fact that there was nothing I wanted more to do than make my living writing science fiction. By the time I was 16 or 17, I put away childish things. It didn't occur to me to try to do that until I was in my mid to late 20s. And in doing so, and I wasn't even sure why, initially I wasn't sure why I felt that might be something I could do. But looking back, I think that I decided it might be something I could do because I knew the rules. Because I'd been a science fiction reader and a science fiction fan, and I understood the rules. But by the time I started to try to write this stuff, I also understood that some of the rules were boring. I had no interest in writing fiction that obeyed those rules. I think some of the rules were formal and overt, and some of them were cultural and unconscious. And the ones that I had the most problems with were cultural and unconscious. For instance, that the future, capital F, would simply be the United States writ large. I didn't want to do that. Another one was that women's position in society would never change. I didn't want to do that. I had a whole list of those things that I didn't want to do. And when I wrote Neuromancer, I actually had the list on a file card, and I made a point of inverting each one of those concepts in the course of the novel.
So anti-genre,
Yeah.
rather than genre.
Well, playing against it. Somewhere years ago, I read an interview with John Le Carre in which he said that someone asked what he thought of Ian Fleming's fiction, and he said, "I owe him everything. I've made my whole living playing against the expectations he's set."
So without the negative example of James Bond, we would never get Le Carre's much more morally sophisticated, politically informed, better fiction.
It could be, I would agree, but at the same time, it could be formulated in a value-free way, because it could as easily go in the opposite direction.
So someone could take Bond and out-Bond Bond, the same way that Le Carre.
Well, someone could reverse engineer their own Bond out of Le Carre.
So someone could take Neuromancer and go back to Starship Troopers. Why would you want to? That's the nature of humans in writing. You never know why people really do these things. Well, when you were formulating these rules that you wanted to invert, did you have specific examples in mind, or was it just sort of this sense of the culture in which science fiction was produced and consumed?
It was purely cultural. I felt rightly, I think, that science fiction had been my native literary culture. It was where I became a reader, and an obsessive reader in the way that 13-year-old boys became obsessive readers of science fiction in those days. And I knew that I had grown up in a very small town in southwestern Virginia, and I had been a science fiction fan. But I was no longer a guy who was like a guy from a small town in southwestern Virginia, and I didn't want to be writing novels that were like the majority of the science fiction novels I've run across.
What interests me about this idea is that it seems to be a kind of a push-pull between love of the genre and, I wouldn't say hate of the genre, but recognition of the genre's shortcomings, or is this just Sturgeon's law in practice?
Well,
And for those of you who don't know Sturgeon's law, should I?
yes.
Theodore Sturgeon was a writer of quote-unquote hard science fiction who was once asked by a literary critic whether or not it was true that 95% of science fiction was shit. He responded, 95% of everything is shit. Which, if you look at network television, large swaths of Amazon.com, etc., might be
My 5% when I was an adolescent reading science fiction wasn't Heinlein or Asimov or Bradbury or any of that pantheon. my 5% was Alfred Bester and Fritz Leiber and people from the so-called British New Wave. Like I immediately honed in on what I liked, and what I liked was, I can now see, very odd. It was very odd, but it all became something. Like long before I started to try to write science fiction, that stuff existed as a kind of counter force within the genre. And there was intense hostility between force and counterforce, and I can remember actually being sort of frightened when I was 13 or 14 years old, reading the counter criticisms of the two sides.
In the letters columns of Astounding or something like that.
And so that was my first experience of revolutionary art, I think. Seeing this culture war within science fiction. And that I turned up reading, I started to read science fiction just as that culture war was really getting going.
And within a genre that was marginalized by much of the culture, there would then be a dominance and marginality dynamic within that as well. Well, what are your influences outside of the genre in which you've written and done such great stuff? And I know you've talked about this in other venues, but...
Well, as I've gotten older, I've become suspicious of this idea of influence. And while it's actually true that I discovered Edgar Rice Burroughs and William Burroughs probably in the same month, which, definitely has something to do with where I'm coming from.
Alphabetically, were you working?
They were on opposite sides of the same twirling wire rack in the Greyhound station. The station had the most daring literature available.
Testing.
I'm not sure where we should hold these things, but we can hold them here, I suppose. So the Greyhound, that's actually a very important part of the positioning of science fiction in the broader culture, is that kind of paperback revolution period where, the rocket ships on the covers of pulp magazines and all of that stuff. But you'd also literally found William S. Burroughs in the same place?
Well, I found a very early, very cheap paperback anthology of beat writing that had some legally publishable excerpts of Naked Lunch. And I took it home and hid it because I didn't think my mother would want me reading stuff.
So even though it was legal, it was immoral?
Yeah, it seemed like I knew that it was sort of outside reading. So when I started to write, people asked me what my influences were. I said, William Burroughs, Thomas Pynchon. And I had my list, but really it was a list, I was sincere, but it was also a list of writers I would have liked to be associated with. So I think that now when I hear anyone answer the influence question, I think, yeah. He wants to be seen as somewhat like John Updike.
Well, why would anyone want that?
People do that. But now when I look, now looking back, I kind of wondered that the people I suspect the people I've never given credit to, and I suspect that Lynn Dayton's early spy novels probably had a really powerful effect on how I write. I haven't reread them for decades and decades, but I can remember bits of business that Layton accomplished in it. that I had never seen anywhere else, and they stayed with me. So now what I think it is with writers, it's not the conscious influences, but it's the personal microculture that you've established as a reader before you start to write. It's everything you've read. It's your innate sense of what's good and what's not good for you as a reader. And I think that that's what we learn to find when we're learning to write fiction. I don't think you can learn to write fiction without having first been taught to be a reader of fiction.
And the different kinds of fiction that you've invoked here are very much parallel to the different genre aspects of your own book. I mean, Naked Lunch is as disjointed and crazy a book as almost imaginable, and there are certain of your texts that have that kind of choppy narrative and jumping around, jump cuts or whatever the film term would be. But they also have this sort of serious plot construction that you require for a thriller or a heist movie or that kind of genre you're working in as well. And is that what you took from Dayton? Was how do you put together the suspense of whether or not X will be pulled off? Was it craft on some level, or is it deeper than that?
It was Dayton John Le Carre gets a lot of credit for having invented a language, a kind of English for espionage that didn't exist before he wrote the Smiley books, but it's now the one that all spies actually use. And I think that's a wonderful thing. But Dayton did something else with the language of the character's business that I don't even like to want to look at it too closely, or it might stop working for me, but I think it's something that I emulated. I think we emulate this.
Right. And there is a certain feedback loop between fictional representations of various parts of our world and the worlds themselves. And you see this as far back, at least as Raymond Chandler in The Big Sleep. Philip Marlowe just dismisses somebody's thug as he's a tough guy talking like they do in the movies. They all talk like that now. Even though it's a fictional representation of a tough guy being fictionally represented sort of multiply. But in terms of our larger theme here, and by the way, the person who designed the logo for this year's festival's in the room.
Congratulations, this is really cool. Because it operates on multiple semiotic levels simultaneously. Those of you who can't see it over there. If you read it without saying it in your head, it's tech knowledge. I found, though, that I could not do that because of the E being in this red neon, so I pronounced it as technology without even meaning to. And then I thought, I'm illiterate now. I'm losing my ability to read properly, until I remembered that design features of this text influence how you're going to read and interpret it. And it seems to me that that's one thing that's worth talking about here, because we live in a manufactured world, we live in a world of technology. How has technology influenced how you write? Just on a very literal level. There's a myth out there that you still use a manual typewriter because that's what you did for Neuromancer, before there were PCs really to use. But how do you use technology yourself in the process of writing what you write?
Well, I guess compared to some people, I'm only scarcely beyond the manual typewriter. I think I wrote a novel and a half with my manual typewriter, then started with an Apple IIc, and I've never actually had a computer that wasn't an Apple. And I now have a 3-year-old MacBook and an iPad, and I suspect that my next book will be written partly on the iPad, because I've just found it's easy to do, and it makes for better sprawling on the sofa, if that's what.
Sofa technology is highly underrated.
If that's what's required. The thing it took for me to make the shift from analog to digital was having Bruce Sterling phone me up from Austin, Texas one afternoon, and he said, "Man, I've got a machine here that automates the writing of fiction." And I said, what is it? And he said, "It's called a word processor. My dad gave it to me because he's buying a new one." And
I always picture word processors being like food processors. You know, you put it in, you hit blend.
Well, I had always pictured them as being these huge desk-sized machines. I mean, Stephen King was the first guy I ever heard of who used a word processor, and it was said to be enormous. And it wasn't a computer; it was a purpose-built Wang word processor. And the Wang people were like miles ahead in word processing, but they just didn't think that this personal computer thing was ever going to take off. So
they needed to hire some science fiction writers to predict the future of the market for them, right?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, that can go, that can have a sad end too.
Well, in terms of your own work, your latest 3 novels, and I'm not sure if they've got a formal trilogy title yet, but I think of them as the Big End trilogy, for the one character who's the Hubertus Big End, or Bigen, one of the through characters in the 3 texts, are set in the present. But it still feels like the future, somehow. Something about your prose, but also something about the way, and you've described this in other venues as, the science fiction shifting to be speculative fiction about the recent past, and Earth being an alien planet now, because technology changes so fast. Each of these novels is still a thriller on some level. There's still a driving plot, sort of fear for the characters and uncertainty about how things are going to work out. But what drives these plots, the thing that most interests me about these works, or one of the many things that interest me about them, but maybe the most compelling part for me, is that what everyone seems to be engaged with is some kind of creativity, some kind of art that's being fostered by the internet, or distributed through the internet, or stolen and spied on through these means. In pattern recognition, the footage, this mysterious film that's being released in a way that no one seems to quite understand who's making it or where it's coming from. The idea of locative art in spook country, where people are programming things through GPSs so you can stand at a spot and put on a helmet and see the dead body of River Phoenix in front of the saloon he died in front of. Or whatever, and in the manufacture of fashion in Zero History. What I'm interested in asking you here now is why the creativity, is this like an anti-McLuhan message? It's not the medium, it is the message? I mean, is the internet there to let anything happen that can happen? Or is this just total babble on my part now?
I think it's about the internet turning itself inside out.
That would be messy.
Or one of the characters in Spook Country says that cyberspace, it's everting, and I think it's everted considerably more since Spook Country was published.
And that's all of what, 4 years now, 5 years?
Yeah, and I think that in the longer sense, I think that what seems to me to be happening is that it's becoming something that we won't talk about it because it will have colonized everything. I mean, I've always, it was fun to have my little neologism, cyberspace, turned into a word that lots of people use every day to describe something that's actually real. But what I've always been most interested in is how it would disappear. like I saw it come into use, and I thought, well, am I going to see it go out? And I think it's starting to go out because it no longer describes what's happening. And when people started using cyberspace to describe aspects of their life experience, it was kind of somewhere else. It was over there. It was behind the screen of your computer. It was kind of a nominal space. And now it's not like that at all. We all move constantly, literally and physically, through its coordinates.
And in ways that are both good and bad, perhaps. I mean, the sort of omnipresence of smartphones, for instance, have totally ruined barroom arguments. Because now someone will always say, let me get my brain out, and then they will take it out and look it up, and you will have an answer. And this, this is a process that, William S. Burroughs begins describing in the 1950s as the externalization of ourselves, right? I mean, how many people in this room, if you lose your phone, you have no one's phone numbers, right? No one memorizes phone numbers anymore. No one writes them down in little books. They're in your phone, and so that phone has become like an extension of yourself. And this is where I think you're exactly right, Bill. It's, we no longer have cyberspace and reality. We have cyber reality or something, or I'm not going to try to coin a word. It'll be bad. And you see this, too, in the physical, where people are walking across campus all the time on a phone, and they aren't where they are. They're in there. And I know they're in there because sometimes my students are talking about things they wouldn't want me to hear if they saw I was 4 feet away from them. But they're not here. They're somewhere else. And that place has become kind of omnipresent. So how do you... So has the present become the future? That's why your books are set now?
It's like we look at the Victorians and well, for some reason they had a need to deny that sex existed. And I think when we're the Victorians, people will be looking back at us and saying, for some reason they had a need to distinguish between what they thought of as the real and the virtual.
Which means that but again, are these two categories simply empty categories now? I mean,
Well, they're becoming, yeah. But they're still very, powerfully, culturally in play, and those two categories, and I think they'll remain so for a while. I don't think it'll be resolved for at least another generation.
Well, it seems to me that like the idea of virtual tourism, say, why go to Rome when you can see the whole Sistine Chapel ceiling on your computer? That hasn't seemed to quite got there. People are still going to Rome. People still want to have this sense of feeling and encountering the real in the way it's been defined in the past. And maybe it's going to take time to build up to that moment where, no, it doesn't matter where you are equally everywhere, technologically or culturally both. But another question about the last three books, and one of the things that most struck me the first time I read it was that there's this character who I already mentioned, Hubertus Bijand would be the correct pronunciation, but everyone calls him Big End because that's how it's spelled. And generally in certain kinds of fiction, if you have a shadowy, powerful figure with lots of money who can make a phone call and a car pulls up and you're handed, a plane ticket to Tokyo and you're off and that kind of thing. They tend to be working for some government agency or some kind of multi-zillion-dollar corporation. This guy's an advertising executive. And it seems, why did you choose that? What kind of discourse is advertising for you that it can become a generator of 3 great books, 3 really complicated, compelling plots? Why advertising?
Well, I think to some very real extent, marketing has become what we do. We used to make stuff, but now we farm the making of stuff out to those nations who haven't gotten quite so totally first world as we imagine ourselves to be. And we still invent some stuff, but mainly we seem to market stuff. And there are economies in the world today that I totally don't understand, like the economy of Portland, Oregon, where everybody seems to sell everybody else coffee and moccasins.
And bicycles. Don't forget bicycles.
And bicycles.
Yeah.
And it works.
Or in Chicago, we used to make steel, now we sell each other half-off coupons
Yeah.
for T-shirts. Right? And I'm stealing that from Dan Sinker. That's not original to me.
Well, so, I just thought that was, if I wanted to write books that would make some attempt to explore that, it would be handy to have a character who was in the business, although that wasn't really how Big End arrived. When Big End arrived, I thought that he was going to be an occasional walk-on character through the book, and he was basically somebody who would give the heroine a tough assignment and occasionally top up her
So M from the
platinum,
Bond books.
yeah, top up her platinum credit card. And so I wasn't expecting much from him at all. I just wanted this kind of interestingly repellent character.
Well,
And then he started talking, and whenever he started talking, I was like, "Who is this guy?" And when that happens with a character, it's really, really important to listen.
yeah. Mark Twain always said the same thing, that he'd listen to his characters, and then that's how, for instance, Pudd'nhead Wilson turned into the book it did because of the voice of Roxy, or so on. But and I'm interested in the way you just put that, because when I was first reading pattern recognition, the minute I realized how big End was going to be in this book, it rang a bell to William Burroughs, the character of Benway in Naked Lunch. And here's just the introduction of Benway. Benway is a manipulator and coordinator of symbol systems, an expert on all phases of interrogation, brainwashing, and control. And this for me was Big End, even though not so much interrogation. He's not a torture guy. But that leapt out of me, and it also fit with things from other worlds. And this is one of the things I love most about science fiction and speculative fiction. They will drag in things that you don't expect, sort of unconsciously. And that is the death of newspapers, which is something that is very important to me as a occasional journalist, but reader of newspapers. We tend to think of things like newspapers and even news on the radio or television as stuff we're supposed to get because it's good for democracy or good for the world or because we deserve it and we've always gotten it. But in reality, newspapers are simply scaffolds of advertising in which there are news holes. And as the scaffold of advertising gets smaller, the news hole shrinks. Same thing with television. If you don't have the ratings, which is what advertisers give you money based on, your art goes away, or your news becomes more and more reality TV and less actual news. So the world we live in is a giant matrix of advertising in which other things just happen. And we think the other things are what matter, but it's really the advertising that drives it all, trying to sell us particular logos or brands. And even, I would say, even genres fit that model, right? On some level, anyway. And I realized that wasn't a question, that was kind of a screed. I apologize. The plan for today does involve questions from the audience, but given the cyber-spatial angle here, I solicited some questions in advance from my colleagues and students in the English department. So I'm just going to run a couple of those questions past you, Bill, and then we can shift gears. And I think they might have to take one of our microphones away, which is sad, because it took us so long to get them all. So here's one of the questions from a colleague of mine. Sometimes it seems that your fiction is very concerned to get beyond dichotomies of real versus simulacrum, or private consciousness versus public consciousness. But at other times, the potential eradication of these dichotomies, English professors talk like that, I apologize, seems to invoke a kind of uneasiness or even terror that drives your plots forward. How do you explain this? And I think this is back to what we were talking about earlier about virtual versus reality. I mean, if there's no difference anymore, why would people be scared? Why would plot happen?
Well, I always forget which French poet said, "The city changes faster than the human heart."
I think it might be Baudelaire.
Yeah, and I think there's an element of that sensibility in all of my work. I also,
So if I can
Yeah.
make sure I'm understanding what you just said. So while the technological matrix in which we all exist might be changing, people are the same, or people's hearts are the same. The human reality doesn't shift as fast as the technological reality.
well, my sense of it is it's simpler. It's simply that it inherently saddens us all to some extent when the environment that we grew up in goes away. And nothing, it's, Baudelaire was modern. It's a
Right,
modern
right.
sensibility. It's like everything goes away. The things you knew when you were a child aren't there anymore. And that seems to be more constant and faster for us than it was for people 500 or 600 years ago. That may not even be true, but I think it seems that way. But I actually believe that virtually possibly every, although it takes a bit of imagination, that every technology is morally neutral until you do something with it.
So human agency is still behind anything that happens real or
Yeah.
virtual.
Yeah, and since I also think that when we get an emergent technology, regardless of what the people who sold it to us thought we were going to use it for, we'll wind up using it for things that they never dreamed of. Some of which will be ethically nightmarish, and some of which will be just wonderful. And in that respect, our culture is out of control because change in our civilization, as far as I can see, is driven purely by emergent technology. It's not really driven by much of anything else unless you want to go all Malthusian on it. And there is that, but by and large, it's driven by emergent technology. And that goes back to the day when knowing the right way to break a piece of flint was shit-hot emergent technology.
Yeah. And I think that's actually in the program for the Humanities Festival. There's someone demonstrating flint napping. I kid you not.
Well, that was a big one. We wouldn't be sitting here without that one.
No, a million years of skinning animals on the savannah. got
And
us here.
we live, I think, at the top of a really quite randomly accumulated pyramid of technology, and
Yeah, we still couldn't get the microphones to work right.
it's getting higher. It's getting higher all the time, and we're sitting here with our microphones that don't quite work. But you can't do cities unless you can store cereal. And if your city gets too big and you don't know how to do sewage, everybody gets sick and dies. And all of that stuff's in play. If any of that stuff backed up on us, we'd be in trouble. We're just not conscious of the broad base of the pyramid anymore
Right.
because we're quite far away from it.
Except when the sewers break.
Yeah.
When the sewer main breaks, we realize it. Well, let me add a nuance or maybe counter a little bit. I made a mistake of trying to be prophetic about 7, 8 years ago at a conference at Oxford, where I gave a paper with the following title that will haunt me forever: "Why ebooks won't work." Sort of the opposite of cyberspace. And it was, the people I was dealing with at this conference always talked about this kind of mythical African or Indian village where there were no bookstores, but people could download the whole library of the world onto their laptop, which they could somehow charge up, I don't know, rubbing stones together or something. And obviously I've been proved terribly wrong, but one of the arguments I made then that I think still holds on some level, it's not just technological change that drives things, it's the capitalistic exploitation of technological change. My argument was that ebooks wouldn't work because every 3 or 4 years, Macintosh or Apple or whoever was going to have to sell you a new ebook or they'd go out of business. So Amazon, for instance, they can sell you the Kindle and you can download certain things, although one of the first books they let you download, they also took back, 1984. Remember that little disappearing act? That was quite interesting. So if you're going to have to buy a new ebook every 3 years and relicense the text that you bought versus the physical object of a book, I just thought it was untenable, and obviously I'm as wrong as can be because ebooks are outselling certain categories of print books now. But how do you see the sort of mesh or balance between emergent technology and just naked money making?
Naked money making is and always has been a big part of the way in which the street finds its own uses for things. Like how can we make a buck with this, or how can we steal these? How can we get these for free? Somehow, I don't think I'm gonna. I'm not gonna have my there goes the neighborhood moment with books until I walk into a 7-Eleven and see a $14.95 universal e-reader that is kind of an off-brand.
And no one will make one of those until those texts are all somehow available, right?
Look at the MP3 player market. I mean, you can get.
There's a million little iPods out there of various
you can
knockoffs.
get little no name things, and every once in a while I run across some, I guess, pioneering individual who's reading one of my books pirated onto their iPhone.
And you're okay with that?
Well,
you don't ask them for a buck or two just to make up for it?
No, I kind of say, let me see that, and I kind of scroll through a bit of it. That's kind of amazing, and so I don't know. It all seemed all those Kindles and things. It all seemed so civilized. I mean, they have people. My agent talks to them like there's some cash money there, but I kind of wonder how long that will hold. This idea of, I think one of the things that's going to look really quaint about us in a decade or so is that we have all these different gadgets that do specific things. And
like your phone that takes pictures.
Yeah. Well, our phones are kind of the cutting edge of that now, that they're starting to do everything. And things get smaller and cheaper, and then your refrigerator is giving you instructions to get to the
milk is spoiled because they can read the.
Yeah.
Not joking, by the way. Your milk is spoiled. Go click. Yeah, but and this is where you talk too about the cultural changes that then come from this. The fact that everyone's phone is now a camera as well changes our notions of privacy. Anywhere you go, someone can be taking your picture and this is a plot point in Zero History as well, right? Can be taking your picture while they, as far as you can tell, they're just talking on their phone. And all sorts of ramifications come out of that are useful for writing fiction, but are also changing the way we relate to one another in quote-unquote real space, to the degree to which that still exists.
Yeah.
All right, we got about 10, maybe 15 minutes left at most. I know we started late, but we do have to respect everyone's time. So if there's going to be questions from the audience, I guess I have to give up my microphone. I've been rendered mute. Oh, I'm not rendered mute. Yay. This belongs to a character named Angel. I just want you all to know. Oh, yes. Okay. So I guess questions from the audience. You know how it works. Right there behind you, or to your right.
Hey, you. What's blowing your mind right now? Like, what are you reading that you really dig?
What am I reading? David Mitchell, who I discovered late, a South African writer named Lauren Bucas, whose name I can't spell, whose book Zoo City you should run right out and get, and I've just to my great and filthy delight completed reading the final volume of Richard Cadre. I think it's the final volume, the third volume of Richard Cadre's Sandman Slim saga, which is the best of the three, I think. And that's three.
Okay, cool. Right here, and then we'll go over to the second row there. The blue sweater, you're...
I was going to ask really quick how we should more comfortably become Cylons.
Excuse
And
me?
by that, I mean, we had discussed previously, you'd mentioned Baudelaire and how the city changes faster than
Yeah.
the heart. We'd
Yeah.
spoken of the eventual disappearance of the term cyberspace
Yeah.
and how we are increasingly embodying our own technology while in many cases becoming increasingly aloof as to the science generating that technology or the economic contexts mediating the delivery of that technology into our everyday lives. So at what point then have we successfully contained our discomfort, our distance between that alienation from the manufacture of this stuff, of this technology, be it cyberspace, GPS, otherwise, so that it's perhaps successfully packaged for commercial purposes, or so that it continually generates 500 to 600 page novels in unending series.
Is this a question about the uncanny valley? When the virtual or the robotic is now real?
Sort of.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
No,
Okay.
and it might actually be a step beyond that because it is real. In fact, it's almost past tense. It's how we feel about it, perhaps.
It makes
I feel
me,
great.
It makes me think about it makes me think about Cory Doctorow's dictum that if you haven't violated your warranty, you don't own the thing. and the future of freedom lies in the violation of all sorts of warranties. I would assume.
I remember one of your characters in Zero History opening a Mac, like opening an Apple computer,
Yeah.
which you're not supposed to do, right? It's supposed to be a closed system.
And he had the right drivers.
And the right tools.
Yeah.
And he knew what it looked like, so
Yeah.
he could tell if it had been with-fucked, I believe was the term. Over here?
Like a lot of your readers, I've developed kind of a Google addiction between your Twitter feed and your novels, searching for credit calculators and old school watches and buzzrocks and jackets. I just wondered, what is your source for all your strange, interesting things that you fill your novels with?
Oh, it's just stuff that I bump into, and I just naturally bump into. My pleasure in life is bumping into things like that. And when I find a new thing like that, I sort of toss it into a hopper as potential reference material for fiction. And sometimes if I'm lucky, the stuff in the hopper sort of has been like breeding while I haven't been looking, and I'll get like these really weird mutant
The robots are...
things.
Well, where do you bump into things, where do you go to look to bump into things? Might be another way to put that question.
Well,
Like, what are your reading habits?
Everywhere. Well, increasingly for the sort of thing I think we're talking about, it's definitely net driven. It's a Google thing. Like once a month, somebody will say, "Go here, check these out," and wow, instantly in the hopper.
I'm picturing, of course, Nighthawks, right? It's in the hopper.
Yeah.
The painting rather than the real. What?
That is far from the lamest pun I've made here today. But in all seriousness, about the Twitter feed, do you find that as like a good reflexive way to write and to engage? Because Twitter is usually depicted in the broader culture as kind of a celebrity stalking device, like what did a Kardashian have for lunch today kind of medium. But it seems to me that you can do anything you want with this medium, as Dan Sinker did with at Mayor Emanuel.
Well, you can set it. The beauty of it is, the beauty of Twitter, I think, is that you can set it up to be whatever you want it to be. It's open. It's a much more open-ended structure than the other social media networks, as far as I can see,
Right.
which feel to me sort of like saying, hey, let's get together. You want to meet me at the mall? No.
But the mall is online now. You don't actually have to go there.
Yeah, well, I don't want to go to the mall. I don't want to go to the mall online. So virtually none of my Twitter experience involves the Kardashians. And in fact, I have to.
They don't follow you?
I'm someone who has to infer the existence of the Kardashians from the odd tweet.
So you can be kept up with everything.
Well, it's probably good. It's good for me that way, because I get it wrong, but in interesting ways. I actually did ask my wife last month. I said I saw the Kardashians on a magazine, and I said, "What do they do?"
What do they do, was the question.
What do
The
they
answer
do?
is
And
nobody knows.
that was basically what she started telling me, and then she kind of slowed down and she said, I don't know.
And it is the kind of future that Andy Warhol predicted, right? Everyone will be famous for 15 minutes, but he got the time wrong.
I suspect that they could have been characters in virtual light, like sort of walk-ons in virtual light.
Right.
And they wouldn't have stood out, but it would have been a little bit too subtle for the parodic level of the text. Like they wouldn't quite have fit, but they're really quite a lot like that.
Or like the daughters in pattern recognition, or zero history.
Yeah, I think that the 3 books, my second 3-book set, did a better job of capturing something of the immediate future from when they were written.
Of
Really.
the generation of celebrity culture. And,
Yeah. It's sometimes I find myself thinking about those books.
Yeah,
and
because of
going,
course in terms of contemporary political events, the Twitter business is as much given credit for some of the political events in the Mediterranean and the Middle East over the last 6 months. And of course, there was a lot of blowback against that too. People saying that Twitter had nothing to do with organizing these protests that ended up toppling governments. People just spontaneously got together some other way. And there seems to be a certain denial about the power of the technological shift, which is maybe a software shift even. Maybe it's not technology, it's design.
Yeah,
some level.
the governments don't, societies don't really like that. I'm fairly certain that if the United States government had known, and I say that because it sort of happened here, if the United States government had known what would happen when DARPA got together with a bunch of acid head computer builders, they wouldn't necessarily have let it happen. It changed too much. I mean, it was too much. It's like too much of a game changer. But in the way of emergent technologies, they had no way of knowing, and neither really did anybody else.
You can't predict it.
No,
I think we have time for maybe one more question up here in the, can you sprint across?
I'm just curious, the Singularity is Near, book by Rick Kurzweil, talks about human beings and technology merging into singularity, and after that, something's different. And I just wondered your reaction to that.
When will technology and humans merge into one?
Oh, I think I've always thought of that as the geek rapture moment. But I think it's not that it's going to happen, but that it's already happening. The difference is sort of between the difference in, the way I look at that, it's like the difference between the images we were shown in the 80s. The images we were shown in the 80s that would.
You mean the moon landing that didn't happen?
No, the VR imagery, you know,
Tron.
the girl with the gloves and the goggles and her hair being blown back beautifully by the experience she was having under the goggles, and like that was our virtual reality feature, and that's like an objective correlative of what actually happened. But what actually happened was that if the content, the interactive content, is sufficiently intense, you don't need the goggles and the gloves. There's nothing for you but what you're seeing on the screen, and you don't have to worry about cooties or who wore the helmet. So we never got the goggles and the gloves, and we probably never will. It's like a feature that never happened, like the flying car or the jetpack.
The jetpack.
But we needed the flying car and we needed the jetpack to help us do something culturally, like to move forward. And I think we'll all be living on the other side of a bunch of very singular stuff one day, or our descendants will. But I think that the idea of a single event utterly sundering experience seems like very medieval to me. It seems like a very 4th century, it seems kind of religious. But actually, it's more like there's not going to be any future because things are changing too quickly for us to be able to afford one. There's just going to be more and more stuff.
More and more of the present.
It's going to be stranger and stranger, and as it happens to you, you will be in the present moment, and it will be weird. And on that, I'll close on that.